Zach.
Look at us repping Babolat.
Look.
What good sponsees we are.
How many hours are you doing these days?
I'm doing about 20, maybe a little bit more.
That's good.
It's not too bad. Yeah, we've got performance groups back going, but two to a court.
Okay, well that's good.
Yeah, and then I'm doing some privates and stuff like that as well. So yeah, it's not bad. It's actually like, obviously I want to get back into a little bit more full time, but it has been nice. You see how, at least for me, when I'm not working 35, 38, 40 hours a week, you see how your brain starts to like be more creative and you come up with ideas and you start working on other projects. And it's like,
exactly.
Whereas when I'm doing, the 12-hour days from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. sort of thing, it's like you get home and your brain is just fried and there's no mental energy to even think about working on a new project or something exciting. So there's been benefits to this for sure.
Well, for sure. No, and I mean, I've been there on both sides when you're sort of grinding 40, 45 hours a week, and then, there's just no time to sit down, reflect, and really sort of do some of the stuff that's exciting and off court. But, if you can manage about 20 hours a week, I think that's perfect because you can really give it 150% every time you're out there, plus have the time to plan.
Yeah, for me, it just shows how it's not only about time, it's about mental capacity, and just the rest and recovery, how important rest and recovery is. And obviously you can see it with players as well, but anyway.
I know. So what would your normal schedule be like, just generally speaking, as you're dealing a lot with performance players, and obviously there's a lot of weekend tournaments and so forth. So what would your general sort of during the year schedule look like throughout the week?
Yeah. So during the year, I'm usually on court at either 6 or 7. And so we've got performance groups, that run 6 to 8 a.m. a couple days a week. And then usually it's privates. So I might do privates from, 6 to 7:30 and 7:30 to 9, or just a 7 to 8 type of thing.
Okay.
So usually on there, and then usually I've got a good 3 or 4 hours off court when I try to take care of all my emails and all that stuff. And then back on court, usually 1:30 or 2:30 with after school privates before groups start at 4. So.
Right. Oh yeah. So how much hitting do you do in those yourself?
I don't do much hitting in the groups.
Right.
And I'd say I do a lot of hitting in the privates, but it's, I try to set things up so I have less work to do. So there's a lot of me standing in the corner, but I do a lot of live ball stuff. It depends on the time of year and what we're working on. There might be some feeding, but I do a good bit of live ball stuff.
Well, and I think, you have to be creative when you're starting to coach players that are doing so well, right? At one point they start becoming better than you, so you have to find a way.
Yeah, especially when you can't move well either, and you can't be running side to side. It's like, all right, I'm going to stand here. I'm going to hit wherever I want. But
no, I hear you. So, I mean, thanks for doing this with me overall. I really appreciate it. It's sort of a new journey that, I'm embarking on, and, with the online content you've been producing, I think it's awesome. So I just wanted to chat with you a little bit about that and, share with the world what you're doing, because I think it's hey, man. There's a lot of content out on the web, but there's few contents that are really sort of respectable and interesting to read. So, what have you been doing overall in the last few months? Like how has this impacted your coaching or your way of delivering messages to your players or further than that?
Well, it's I mean, it's like I said, it's funny, all the different ramifications, because being off court more has allowed me to be a little bit more creative and start thinking about new ideas, and obviously launched my website and started writing more. and then one of the side effects of that was I started writing blog posts and started putting stuff out on a weekly basis. And then the fun thing, which everyone could predict, but it's always funny when it happens, is once you start writing about this stuff, you really start reflecting, right? And then every time I'm writing something, I'm starting to think, well, okay, how do I do things? And am I doing this? Or how would I describe this to someone else? And so it's had a really interesting effect on my coaching, in the sense that I'm having to reflect a lot more and question what I'm doing.
Right. And I mean, it's interesting because I love writing myself as well. It's just that, again, the time constraints, but once you do start writing, it's sort of interesting to see where that goes and where it takes you. And, it could go
Well,
into so many directions.
as much as you think you know something, once you start having to put it on paper and explain it to someone else, you really have to start breaking it down, and you usually get into a deeper level, a level of detail that you didn't even realize was there. So it's
True.
fun.
True. And so you mentioned your website. I know you're doing like your blog is connected to your website, as well as I know you're doing some content writing for lesson planning and so forth. So like, what are some of your, key blog posts that you've put up recently?
I've followed a very systematic structure of I write whatever piques my interest that week. So there's been no flow to it, but
That's
I can
fine.
tell you there's been a couple posts that I really quite like, and I'm proud of, and have garnered a little bit of attention. I wrote one which was very controversial in the early days about how training depth is overrated. Because I said, and so we can talk about that, but I just talked about why depth is good, but training it and training to hit deeper and deeper and deeper is a waste of time. And that one, some people took offense to that one. But that was fun, but I stand by it. And then I also wrote one a few weeks back on statistics in tennis and how we can sometimes misinterpret the data that we see out there, and how important it is to really be thoughtful about how we're gathering statistics and data. So
yeah, I mean, and that's very true. I spoke to Louis Caillet last week, and I brought that up to him, and it sort of was funny to see how it rubbed him the wrong way, because he said, well, nowadays, like, points are twice as long as they were back in the day, because the return gets into play a lot more often than in the past. So he didn't like the idea of people taking that as the third shot needs to be a finishing shot. He goes, no, you need to still be planning. You still need to be working on building the point, grinding the ball. And, instead of just thinking it's a two-shot game.
Well, and that was another, it's funny you say that, because that was on the heels of my statistics post. I think that was the next one, or maybe it was the one before, I can't remember. And it was just about training the first 4 shots, because I said, like, for sure, the data doesn't lie about 70% of points finish inside the first 4 shots, but you look at those first 4 shots, and what does that consist of? That can be first serves, that can be second serves. The returns can be in the middle, the returns can be out of the middle. The server can be on offense on the first shot, which is what everyone trains, but the server can also be neutral on the first shot. They can be defensive on the first shot. And so you look at the options in the first 4, and all of a sudden it's like there's 100 different patterns that you can train, and yet everyone trains big first serve, take your forehand out of the middle. It's like, well, that's not happening every time. So it's okay to say we're going to train the first 4 shots, but it has to be realistic to the situation.
Yeah, exactly. And so, within the training depth article, tell me a little bit more about that, because that's, I mean, I sort of know my thoughts about that, but what sort of gathered your attention, and was it from a specific demographic you got some interest or backlash for that?
That's a good question. I didn't go so far as to look into who was downvoting me, but there's definitely, I think, like the funniest one was I posted it on LinkedIn as I do my posts, and I can't remember if you saw this, but Janko Tipsarevic, who's formerly number 8 in the world, responded and said, "Hey, this is a really well written article, but you're wrong." I was like, well, and he just said, well, training depth is super important. And I just said, well, listen, I mean, it's all there in the article. What I said was, if you break, it all depends how you define depth,
right?
But if you break the court down into everything before the service line, everything between the service line and 3/4 court, and then between 3/4 court and the baseline, is the percentage of balls that land between 3/4 court and the baseline, that deepest zone, is minimal. Depending on the match and depending on the player, whatever, it's like 17, 18, maybe 20%. Very, very small. The majority of balls are landing before 3/4 court. Now, I personally think that anything landing inside the service line most of the time is probably too short. So I'm not going to sit there and say, oh, depth doesn't matter. I think there is a level of depth that you need to maintain quality. But what people don't realize is, first of all, how rare it is to hit at that super, super deep range, and how hard it is to do consistently. These are the pros. These are the best players in the world. And you watch them play, and go watch a match. People don't realize it, but you go watch a match, and just look at where each ball is landing, and you'll be shocked. You'll see one that's a little bit past, and then you'll see one that lands on the service line.
Very true.
But the balls have pace to them. And I talked about this in the article. I said, what you really want to be focusing on is tempo and weight. And so you want to focus on the tempo, the speed of the rally, and what speed you can maintain the rally, and so how little time in between shots can you sustain, and then the weight of the ball, which is the sort of the combination of the speed and the spin. And so that's why those pros can get away with that, because the ball's got a lot of speed and it's got a lot of spin, and so the ball can kick up and get deep. But depth isn't everything, also because of direction, right? If you're hitting cross court, you know, you want the ball to land a little bit shorter because you want to open up the court a little bit. So there's all these different reasons why hitting deep is not as important as people think.
Yeah, and those are some great points, and I think that Nadal would agree with you as far as
well, that was my big mistake, is because the title image was a graph showing Nadal's where Nadal's shots were landing, but I had like 6 of them in the post with Djokovic and Sharapova and Kerber, like flat hard hitters. But everyone looked at the Nadal one and said, "Oh yeah, that's just for Nadal. That doesn't apply to everyone else." I said, "No, it does apply to everyone else. Yeah, just maybe applies a little bit more to Nadal."
Right. Well, and I mean, you know, like I think that the way I look at it often is, you know, the history of the game has evolved with the equipment being so different. And when players used to play with smaller racket heads and heavier rackets, you know, the depth became sort of a weapon so much more than nowadays, where the rackets are lighter, racket heads are bigger. You can generate so much more topspin on these balls and rip that ball so safely, landing it around the service line or just past it, and be so effective with it. Whereas, you know, like to go to the extreme with a wooden racket, you couldn't do that.
Yeah, that'd be really interesting. It'd be a neat study to take a look and see, but the logic makes perfect sense.
Yeah. And so on your website, you know, you're sort of talking a little bit about who you were training and coaching. And I know that you worked with Sharon Fitchman closely a bit for a while. And so, you know, which parts of performance coaching do you really enjoy? Because there's obviously a lot of developmental coaches and coaches that do club coaching, but don't really devote their life and their passion to performance players. You know, which part of that do you enjoy the most? And
it's such a that's a great question. It's you know, I mean, I've definitely pursued the higher end of things for a while, just because that is where my passion lies. But as I reflect on it more and more, because I mean, I was on the road with Sharon for a little bit, and let's be clear, I was never her main coach. I was a sort of a hitting partner coach for a little bit when Larry Jervich was coaching her. But a little bit of time with her, you know, I was able to help Razvan a little bit, who was, you know, top 300 ITF juniors. And the more I reflect on it, that stuff is really good. But I've also worked, you know, I worked with a boy a few years back who was the #1 U10 in BC. And so the more I reflect on it, the more I think it really comes down to who is all in, who is fully committed, who's willing to go above and beyond, and who's willing to buy in. Because if you look at Sharon, you know, Sharon was nuts, the work ethic she had. I remember being on court with her, you know, hitting serves, and she would hit the target 6 times, and she'd go, "Well, it's only been 20 minutes. I think I should do another 2 baskets." And it's like, okay, just go hit more serves. You know, Razvan, when we were in Montreal, he would take the bus for an hour and 40 minutes to go hit serves at the club. Like, just this level of dedication to practice. And both of them, you know, bought in completely. You know, I could tell them whatever I wanted and they would do it, because they had that level of trust, and they understood that they had to trust the process. And that's the same thing with juniors. I've worked with juniors like that. And it's, that's when it becomes really interesting, because then you're really, you know, that's high performance, regardless of your actual tennis level. That's what high performance is about, you know, the relentless pursuit of a goal. And so I think that's where the work of the coach becomes really interesting, when you're both all in on this shared vision.
Yeah, very true. Yeah, that certainly makes it a fun environment then, doesn't it? Yeah. And what about with parents? Do you have to deal a lot with parents, and how do you see a parent's role within their child's development, and sort of as a triangle between yourselves, the player, and the parents?
It's so funny you say that, because just for the past few weeks, I've been attending a series of online webinars once a week, hour and a half a week. Okay. And it's for all sports. And there've been a couple different topics, and not last week, but I think the week before, it was about working with parents. And there was a pre-reading from a book, and they talked about how the notion of dealing with parents is we never deal with anything good, but dealing is always with bad. And so we should stop saying dealing with parents, but working with parents. So I'm going to call you out on that one.
Did I say dealing?
Yeah, but that's okay. That's the standard term in tennis, unfortunately. No, I mean, it's funny. I had the chance to Oded Jacob, obviously, who works here and organized a great webinar with Nick Saviano a couple weeks back. And I asked Nick, I said, I asked him a question about players' mindsets and beliefs and stuff. And he hit the nail on the head when he said, the two most influential people in a child's life are their parents. Regardless of how much time you spend on a tennis court and the relationship with the coach,
right.
the parents are still super, super influential. And so as a coach, if you want to have any hope of, enacting change, you've got to be on the same page with the parents, and you've got to be working with them. So it's always, there's always challenges, but there's always challenges working with kids as well. But it has to be done.
Right. There's challenges in every relationship, I think, as you sort of spend more time together, no matter, what it is. Right. And so it's just a matter of working together rather than dealing with the parents.
That's it. You hit the nail on the head.
Of course. Well, because, often what I found, at least in my past, is that, we all have that same goal of wanting that kid or the player, whoever that is, to succeed and be the best version of themselves. Right. And so it's just a matter of communicating well enough.
And I think that, and I think that there's two sides. The extreme ends of the spectrum are where you want to stay away from. And so there's the obvious case that I think, everyone recognizes, which is that, if the parent is dictating everything and telling the coach what to do and all that, then that's a problem. But there's also this other mindset that, the pendulum shifts the other way, where the coaches feel like they shouldn't have to talk to the parents at all. And you're not allowed to come on court, and you're not allowed to text me, and we can't talk about this, and I'm going to tell you everything what to do. When the reality is that, as coaches, we can learn a lot from the parents, just in terms of they know more about their kid. They know maybe what their kid is going through. They understand certain things about that. The line, where that crosses the line is when they start to talk about how to do your job on the tennis court. Then maybe there's an issue. But when it comes to understanding the kid and understanding how they deal with adversity and their emotions and what's going on in their life, those sorts of things are things that we can learn from the parents.
Definitely. What's your view on technology of the kids on court, such as using cell phones, going on Instagram, texting during practice?
I've been very lucky in that it really hasn't been a problem for us on court. I really, occasionally I've got to tell a kid, hey, put your phone down. But it's rare. It's less than once a practice. It might only be once or twice a week. Actually, I don't even think it's that much. I'm definitely strongly against it. Let's be clear. I think, you've got 2 hours on court most of the time, and you've got to be dialed in. You've got to be, and I think there's benefits in terms of focus, but I think there's also benefits in terms of just being disconnected from the outside world for a little bit. I talk to the kids about, when you show up, when you walk in the door, you're putting aside everything else that's going on inside your life, because that's a skill that you have to have no matter what you're doing. But if you want a productive practice, you have to be able to do that, because people come in and they've got baggage, they've got stress from school and stress from home. And if you carry that with you into the practice, then if you can't compartmentalize, then you're not going to be able to achieve your goals in anything. So I think there's value in also just learning that skill, that like, hey, these 2 hours are for me. These 2 hours are happening right here. And I'll check my phone at the end of practice, but not during. But like I said, been very fortunate that it hasn't been much of a problem. But once or if it does, then we'll have to institute some policies.
Well, and I think that, like you said earlier, if you're working with players that are all in and really engaged and have that goal of becoming the best tennis player they can or athlete they can, then it's an easier sort of, hey, put your phone away, or easier understanding of, you're here for 2 hours, let's maximize the 2 hours.
I think it's easier, but we are, I think, entering, if we're not already in it, I think we're entering an age where a lot of kids are, becoming addicted to their phones. I think we're already there. And so I think there is like a motivation piece, like you said, and a commitment piece, but I think we're also going to have to accept the fact that the current environment, whether that's an online environment or a real life environment, is creating, a dependency on these devices, and we're going to have to treat it as something that they need help with, not something that has to be necessarily punished.
Yeah, that's definitely to be seen as to where that's taking us all, right? With the technology being so much quicker, accessible, and wearable. But I guess it's all part of the coaching curve, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, with annual planning, how do you approach annual planning with your players? Is that something you sort of do regularly, and how much time do you spend reflecting on the plans from the past few months, or looking at the next few months, or is it week by week, or how do you go about annual planning with them?
Oh, it's a constant, constant battle, and I don't know if you touched on it with Louis, but I think Louis is one of those people, like most experts in the world, where you ask them about planning, and they'll tell you that they do it differently every year because no one has come to a consensus on the absolute best way
Mhm.
to do things. But there are certain guiding principles, in terms of annual planning. I think the most important thing is to determine your scheduling. And so what I mean by that is determining, okay, what are your peaks going to be? What are the important competitions going to be? And of course, there's room for change there, but have a rough idea of that, because and know where your rest is going to be, because that is what's going to maximize the effectiveness of the training blocks.
Mhm.
And that's something that I've always fought against, and I think is really important to, we have to be careful about, is if you work on, you train for 2 weeks and then you go play a tournament, and then you come back and you train for another 2 weeks and play a tournament. 2 weeks usually is not enough time to really work on something. And if you're really working on a new skill, if you're made to do a couple little touch-ups here and there, that's totally fine. And that's why you see at the higher and higher levels, there's way more travel, way more competition, there's way fewer training blocks. But
Mhm.
at a junior level, which is most of the time what we're talking about, the
Mhm.
kids need to be building new skills. There's plenty of work to be done, whether it's technical changes, whether it's tactical changes, but there's new skills that need to be added. And that work usually happens, I'd say, at a minimum over 3 weeks, and usually closer to 4 or 5 weeks. And
Mhm.
so you have to set aside those blocks where they can actually work on their skills, A, where they have the time, and B, where they're not under pressure of results. Because that's the other danger, is even if you say, oh well, we're going to play 3 weeks and then I'll just play a local tournament and then this. But if the local tournament is a selections event or a provincials or something that means something, then under pressure people
Mhm.
revert to their habits. That's normal. And so if
Mhm.
that skill is not fully ingrained, then the player is going to revert back to their habits, and then you're going to have to start from square one or maybe square two, but not where you were. You're going to have to start back from the beginning when you get back on court. And that's something that I find stalls a lot of players, is just poor scheduling in that regard. Whereas if we can plan training block and you go all the way through until the skill is mastered and acquired and it's automatic,
Mhm.
then you have a competitive block and you can go compete for 3 weeks and play a
Mhm.
ton. And then, okay, no tournaments. Okay, training block. Let's work on a new skill, something else that's going to improve your
Right.
game, and go from there. I think that's critical, because otherwise, at the end of the day, Louis has a great quote about there's time to improve and there's a time to prove,
Okay,
right?
there you
And
go.
so when you're competing, that's the time to prove. You're trying to prove how good you are, but
Mhm.
you also need time to improve, because then
Mhm.
the proving doesn't work. So we have to set aside times where it's time to improve, and then you can go and prove your worth.
To do both.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. And now during this time when there's really no competition officially happening right now, are you creating sort of fake peaks for your players, or how are you keeping them motivated to keep their work ethic up and mastering some of their competitive skills?
Yeah, that's been a real challenge. I've been, for a while, obviously we weren't at a place where any sort of competition made any sense.
Hmm.
And then there was a little bit of a period where I was thinking we would organize something ourselves.
Yeah.
And then just last week, I think Sarah Caddy from Tennis BC announced that they were planning some sort of competitive opportunity. So I'm waiting to get a little bit more information on that. But if not, if it's nothing that's suitable, then yeah, I'm hopefully going to try and organize something ourselves.
Hmm.
In the meantime, what I've done is I've made a commitment that every practice is going to be super competitive, and so we're usually playing some sort of game at the start, and then we're playing lots of points at the end, and then even when we're cooperative drilling, I'm trying to make it competitive, either one versus everybody or team versus team or one versus
Hmm.
one. But any format, any sort of competition, just to get the competitive juices going, because that was a major concern of mine over the break, was that kids would lose their competitive energy.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. No, and it's good. It's good if you can create that within that home training environment as well, right? And it sort of makes us think outside of the box how we can do that every
Yeah,
day. Yeah.
and I think the other thing that I forgot to mention is, you talk about home training environment, is we're trying to encourage the kids to go out and play practice matches against just go play, just go to a public court and play a practice match, because that's something that's been sorely missing over the last little bit, just because of the nature of these guys' schedules. And so if we can build that habit a little bit and start to see the eventual benefits of that in terms of autonomy and independence and stuff, then that'll be a nice benefit.
Right. And are you able to chart any matches or get some analytics from your players while they're doing this sort of locally, or how do you go about getting some statistics from them when they do compete?
Yeah, not much right now. During the regular schedule, we try to have, we do have a policy where we expect each kid to video at least one match from every tournament that they play. And so then we can take it back, and usually we get them to cut it up. And then we can take a look at it together and pull out any key stats. So that's useful, A, because we're not always at the tournaments, but B, just because then we have it on video and then you can go back to it. Right now, there's not much of that going on. So we're actually just finishing up a training block right now. And so over the next couple of practices, I'll probably just be doing some charting on live while we're competing. But for the time being, we don't have any analytics coming back from the practice matches. Right.
And what do you find most effective when you are charting matches? And obviously it will depend on the player and the time of year and so forth, but is there a couple of things that you sort of say that, these are really key points when I'm charting, this is what I'm getting most out of?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I was on an Australian podcast a few weeks back, and we were talking about statistics and charting, and I came up with this structure in my head, and I thought this made sense. I think there's three main reasons why we chart, and we have to know which one it is. And so one is to scout an opponent or scout a field of opponents. And so you're trying to find out, okay, well, what is the, average for serve percentage for boys under 18? And you do some charting, or, hey, what is this, how many winners is this guy hitting, or whatever. And so you're trying to scout an opponent. The second reason you might chart is to analyze, to assess improvement. And so you're looking and saying, okay, well, we charted a match in September and you were doing, your first serve points won percentage was this. And now, 2 months later we're charting, and hey, we can see the improvement. And then the third reason is to analyze a specific match. And so to look and say, you're in competition and you just chart that match. And then you can look after the fact and say, here's what you did well. Here's what you could have done better, to assess it after the fact. And so I think we have to know which one you're doing. And so the most common, the scouting one is a little less common, but the two most common are, like I said, assessing a match and assessing improvement. And so if you're assessing improvement, then, that's, I'd say, relatively simple. You have to know what you're working on, and you have to chart at the start, but then you chart at the end, and then you know exactly what you're looking for. Because if you're working on first serve percentage, then hey, you're charting that. If you're working on someone's forehand on court, hopefully you know why you're working on it, and it's to reduce unforced errors when they're rallying. And so then you chart how many unforced errors they make when they're rallying at the start, and then the next match, you get a match of similar length, hopefully, and you chart how many unforced errors they make when they're rallying, and then you can compare. In terms of assessing a match, that's when it gets trickier, because there's tons of systems, there's tons of stats that you can look at. For me, I think there's two approaches. One is the aggressive margin, which you can find information about online or on my website, developed by Bill Jacobson. And the aggressive margin is simple. The aggressive margin is you have a score for each player, and if the player finishes the point by hitting a winner or a forced error, so they force their opponent to miss. In other words, the point ends because they hit a good shot. They get a plus. They get that you add a point to their score. And if the point ends because the player makes an unforced error, then that player gets a minus. You deduct from their score. Okay. And so at the end of the set or at the end of the match, it could be one player's at +10 and one player's at +8, but it could also be that one player is at -6 and the other player is at +2, whatever it is. Right. And that's a really good indicator of the level you're playing at, in terms of, are you playing within yourself? Are you playing too aggressive, or are you playing too passive? Are you getting dominated, or are you just making too many mistakes? And if you break that down, which you can by forehand, backhand, first serve, second serve, volleys, whatever categories you want, you can then say, okay, well, your serve was a +8, so you're serving great, but your forehand was a -3. You were just making a ton of unforced errors. And then you can start to break it down and really analyze that way.
Yeah.
The other charting that I find effective for analyzing a match is just to break it down by first serve points, second serve points, and return of first serve points and return of second serve points. Because those are the 4 ways that any point can start for you.
Mm-hmm.
And we know what the norms are. We know what the norms are for how many first serve points you want to be winning, how many second serve points you want to be winning, and so on and so forth. And so then you can look at the match and go, okay, well, you were doing great on your first serve points, you're doing great on your second serve points. That's why you held for most of the time,
right.
But you couldn't win any of his first serve points, and you were fine on return of second serve. So then you go, okay, well, that's the category that you need to work on, is return of first serve. And that's why you weren't able to break him. And then it went to a tiebreaker and you lost or whatever. So that can also give some real information that applies directly to the outcome of the match.
No, that's very useful. That's great. Yeah. And so, on your website, is there anything on a sort of program that's multiple weeks or months long, or an annual plan of some kind that players or coaches could access, or is it blog posts mainly?
No. So if you go to the resources section, what I've developed is nothing groundbreaking, but I think it's interesting is, once again, like I said, there's plenty of different ways that you can look at tennis, but I broke it down into a few main patterns. Basically, control the middle, win the cross court, change direction. In other words, go from cross to line or line into cross, and then open up the court with, short angles and balls like that. And I've designed these training block packages, what I call them. And so each one, if you take a specific pattern, like control the middle, then there's a section on controlling the middle on offense. When you're attacking, there's a section on controlling the middle on defense, and a section on controlling the middle in neutral. And within each one, then there's video examples of what each one looks like. But then there's also the tactical and technical teaching points, so the keys for success. And then there's a bunch of drills and game situations and ways you can integrate it with the serve and return. So the idea is that you can take one of these, if you're a coach, you can take one of these and basically roll it out on court for 12 to 16 weeks. There's a lot of content in there, and like I said, it's got all the explanations, all the teaching points, all the drills, all the video examples. But I think it's also useful if you're a player, because if you're a player, you can go and see the pros executing this and go, okay, well, now I know what that looks like. And then, like I said, the teaching points are there. So you can go out on a practice court and say, okay, I'm going to focus on, I know that to control the middle, I've got to make sure I orient my body. So I'm going to focus on that the next time I go out there. And there's a lot of material in there.
No, that's awesome. Does any of that apply to any of the higher level adult players as well?
Absolutely. And I think that's probably the key demographic, because those types of players usually are able to practice on their own, right? A 2.025, a beginner player might not be able to practice on their own. They might not have the consistency for it. Right. But if you're a higher level adult player, absolutely. Yeah. There's actually if you go to the website on the resources page, there's a sample. There's a free sample of the way I've done it basically is there's 4 packages for the patterns. And then there's 3 packages for if you just want to work on your attacking skills, or you just want to work on your defending skills, or you just want to work on your rallying skills. And so there's a sample out there of one of the attacking skills pages. And so people can take a look. But yeah, I definitely think that's applicable, because you can take all that and go out on the practice court with a friend and work on it, or take it to your coach and say, hey, I want to work on this specific skill. Absolutely.
Well, yeah, especially nowadays, it's sort of good if you can find something that you can do and train on your own a little bit, or just get an idea by having that visual or the video presentation as well. And so that's good stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
And one of your posts on Instagram was about anticipation, and you may have had more than one, but one of them I noticed. And so, how much do you spend on training anticipation with players and just the perception of what's going on in the game?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's something I'm thinking a lot more about. We have to. I think there's still a lot that we can all learn from this. I mean, when you talk about high level players in any sport, everyone talks about they see the game well, or they see the ball well. They've got good eyes. And so we know that it's a valuable skill. And we also know, which is controversial for some people, that it can be taught. And so the question is just, sorry.
That's okay.
My phone's talking to me. We know that But we know that it's a really valuable skill, and we know that it's a skill that can be taught, which some people disagree with, but there's plenty of evidence for that. The question is then, how much of that, up to what point can we teach it? In other words, is there a special something that these elite few have that
Mhm.
can't be taught? And I think there's probably some truth to that, but I also think that we can teach a great deal of it. So I
Mhm.
spend a fair bit of time I don't teach it in isolation. And so I'll, I'll teach it within a specific skill. And so if I'm working on rallying and I notice, man, this kid, I was on court a few weeks back with an 11-year-old,
Mhm.
and I said, man, she's really not picking up the direction of the ball. So her spacing is always off. She's either too far or too close.
Mhm.
And so then we work a little bit on perception, and we identify zones, and she's got a spot where the ball is heading. And so
Mhm.
then we work on perception because it's linked to the skill that she needs to have, right? Which was to be able to space herself well when she's in the rally. I was working the other day with a boy who's one of the top U12s in the country, in the country, and working on just him approaching the net. And so then he's approaching and I'm passing. And once we've worked on, the volley skills that he needs and the footwork and all that stuff, then we say, okay, well, how can you tell if I'm about to lob? How can you tell if I'm going to pass you line or cross? And then we just
Mhm.
start to look and say, okay, well, what about this? Okay, watch this. Here, watch this. And so I don't teach it in isolation,
Right.
but I spend a fair bit of time on it in tandem with all the other work that we're doing within the specific
Mhm.
training block or that specific skill.
Mhm. Mhm. No, that's awesome. And within that, where a player is trying to improve, seeing the invisible or to the regular eye,
Yeah.
um, are you focusing a lot more on someone's body language or their setup, their preparation, their distance to the ball, or is there one that you prioritize more over any of the others?
So it's such a good question. Yeah, a big part of this, because you're absolutely right when you say, like, it's invisible to the naked eye.
Hmm.
It's about knowing what to look for, and if you don't know where to look, you won't see it. And even I'm in that category sometimes, where you see some high level players anticipate, and you go, what do they see in there? Or you
Yeah.
play against someone and who can just spot a tell, and you go, well, I don't know what they're watching for.
Hmm.
Um, I think it depends on what you're anticipating. And so, if people want to learn more about it, on the resources page, there's a free guide to technical anticipation. But if let's say you're in a situation where your opponent is about to attack you out of the middle,
Hmm.
right? The most important thing, that they're going to attack you. They've got a shorter, higher ball. So that it's going to be fast. You don't have to anticipate that. You know that it's going to be low over the net. It's an attack. It's going to be straight. So that.
Hmm.
The most important thing you have to anticipate there is the direction. And so in that situation, then you look and say, okay, well, what is he or she going to do differently to control the direction? And one of those things that they'll do, usually subconsciously, is their body position will change somewhat. So they'll be a little bit more sideways, or their shoulders will turn a little bit more if they're going to go inside out or down the line. And they'll
Hmm.
be a little bit more open because they want to get the ball more in front than the outside of the ball if they're going cross court. And so in that situation there, if I'm being attacked out of the middle, I'm going to be watching for their shoulder position pre-contact. When they're set up, I'm going to be looking for that. Now,
Hmm.
in contrast to that, if I'm approaching the net and then what am I trying to figure out? I might, depending on how well they're set up, I might be trying to figure out where they're hitting. But one of the other big things I have to figure out is if they're going to lob or not, because that's going to determine how close to the
Right.
net I can get. So in that situation, I'm looking at the grip, because if they open up the grip, then there's a very high chance that they're going to pop it up. If
Hmm.
they go to a continental grip, and they open up the face. But
Hmm.
I'm also going to watch and see the path of their racket. If the path of their racket is if they're behind the ball, then they're probably going to hit it. They're going to level it. They're going to try to pass me. But if I
Hmm.
see the racket dip below the ball, then I know they're probably going to try and lob me. So what you're watching for really depends on what you're trying to anticipate. You've got to break it down by the different ball controls.
Hmm. Hmm. And where does tactical anticipation come into play here, where a player will have that tendency of always going down the line or cross court on a certain shot, and then sort of how much do you rely on that versus the technical visibility of that shot?
A ton. And it's, you talk about me being too old and fat to play against the better kids that I coach. That was what you said, right? You talk about that. It's the only thing that's giving me an edge still is my tactical anticipation, because it's actually a strength of mine. It's
Okay.
critical. And I think it's an area that a lot of players, both of these actually, but I think especially tactical anticipation is an area that a lot of players, if for the 3-0, 3-5, those sorts of players could really benefit from,
Mm.
as long as, once again, what to look for. And it's not about necessarily the eyes, but it's just about understanding what's happening. And so you have to be able to say, okay, every time I serve to the back end, she plays it, she plays a little drop shot, short cross court. So it's not every return, but it's every time I serve to the back end, or it might even be every time I serve to the back end on the ad court. What I tell most of the players is you want to look for patterns. And so you have to be aware of what's happening. There's two steps, basically. The first step is what's happening every point. And so you've just got to notice, okay, I served wide on the ad side, she hit it short, then I came in, she lobbed me. Okay, and you did that process, just goes in your head and then it leaves, that's fine, but it goes in your head. And then the next thing is to just recognize when it happens, starts to happen more than once. So then the next time you have a point where it's like, oh, I served wide and she hit it short again. And you go, wait a second, that happened last time. And then maybe it happens one more time and you go, okay, now I start to see. But if you're not actually thinking about what's happening and you're just playing purely reactionary, then that information never goes in the head and then you can never actually process the patterns. But if you're aware of what's happening, you just notice. You just start to notice, hey, I've done that before. Hey, that happened before. Hey, I keep losing points in this way. And then you start to notice what's happening more frequently than not. And then you can start to figure out, okay, well, in what situations are these patterns occurring?
Yeah, and it's every single age. It sounds like sometimes that that anticipation is easier to be taught when kids have poorer disguise skills, because it's sort of easier to sort of recognize what's coming back next. But
and that is a big misconception about technical anticipation anyway, which is what we talked about before with reading the body language or the grips or certain technical cues, is that it's a very advanced thing, when in fact it is, like you said, it's actually easier to teach it at lower levels, whether it's adults or juniors, because the players give so much away. And so you can teach it to 8-year-olds and 10-year-olds, and you can teach it to players that are 2.5 or 3.0. So yeah.
Exactly. And so, what I'm seeing a lot in our discussions back and forth is always sort of like a system or a way of going about certain things. So, how important is it for you to follow a system or a systematic approach to developing players?
Yeah,
I can see by your smile that it's really important.
It's definitely huge to me, and I probably go too far to the extreme in terms of having structure. But that's just the way my brain works. But in terms of having a system, it's key. And some people, it's funny that a lot of people say like, oh, well, you don't want to be tied down with a system because it limits creativity. And people talk about that on court with like, oh, I just want to let players be creative. But people also talk about it sometimes with coaching, when the reality is actually the opposite, right? Because when you have a system, it allows you to be more creative. And so if I don't have a system and I just coach, my every player looks the same technically, same game style, whatever, then that actually limits me. Whereas if I have a system and I go, okay, I know that there's these different game styles. I know that the decision on how I'm going to shape a player towards a specific game style is based on X, Y, Z, these factors. I know that how I develop their forehand is going to depend on X, Y, Z, these factors. Then all of a sudden that opens up the options. And all of a sudden I've got, okay, well, I can develop this game style with this forehand, with this tactically, I can do this. And then you have all the possible details, and then you can pick and choose and plan. And with an understanding of the logic behind it, it actually allows you to be more creative and go, well, okay, I've got these two options. And I feel like I'm going to do this one because both are valid. So I'm going to do that. It actually allows you to be more creative. Whereas if you don't have a system or a structure and you just kind of do things based on your gut or based on the way you've always done them, then it actually ends up limiting you a great deal.
Yeah, it's an interesting way of putting it. That's great. I love it.
Well, I mean, it's funny, but it's on my mind. Been on my mind a little bit just because of all this writing, but also I've been communicating a little bit back and forth with an education expert in the States, and he talks about that actually in education as well. And he says, like, if you or I were to go into a university and they gave us this math problem that had never been solved, is like, we wouldn't have the slightest chance of figuring it out because of being creative. Right? The people who come up with creative solutions are the experts, right? Because the expert has enough of a foundation knowledge to understand, okay, well, I understand this theorem and this theorem and this theorem. And so I wonder if I could apply them in a different way. The creative solutions come from people who have an understanding of the foundation. And that's true in sports as well. you look at creative players out there. They have an understanding of the tactics, understanding of the technique. They have that base foundation, and then on top of that, they can be creative and play with the foundation.
That's awesome.
It's not me. I stole it from someone else. So
Stolen from someone smarter, right?
always.
Yeah. Well, you have to copy and sort of listen to other people and their experiences, right? And so I think it's fantastic. Yeah. Thanks very much. I really appreciate your time for doing this with me here. And, I think it's a lot of great things that are going to come out of your future, as well as we're working with players and so forth. And I'm excited to see what comes out of that.
It's an absolute pleasure. It's always such a good time to talk to you. And I don't know what I did to deserve being on the same show as Louis Caillé. So there's something wrong with your booking system, but hey, I'll take it.
No. I'm following a structure and a framework, and this is me being creative.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Thank you, Zach. Have a good rest of your day, and we'll chat soon.
My pleasure. Thanks so much. You too.
Thank you.
See you, man.